Faith comes from through hearing.
Yeah, for hearing the word of God, yeah.
Who are we listening to?
Yeah.
Which voices have influence on our lives? And what's the spirit behind those voices?
Yeah.
Is it the spirit of fear?
Yeah.
Or is it the spirit of love?
What if your biggest passion could also be your life's purpose? On the Life Explored podcast, we're uncovering the hidden connections between faith and everyday life, getting to know people and their passions. My name is Wes, and I will be your host on this journey. Each episode, we will have an interesting guest to give us a fresh perspective on life and faith through their own experiences. Join us on this journey as we explore life together. So I know you're a bit of a Bible history nerd, and I know that through talking to you, because you'll just suddenly start reaching into, you know, all these various texts, and you've got, and also kind of other mythological books and sort of historical records of the time as well, because you've done a lot of study of that as well. So, but one of your passions in this area is the sons of God, right? So. I'm not going to read the scripture out, but I'm just going to for our audience, the sons of God are basically feature in Genesis chapter 6, verse 1 to 8. And it is the pre-flood, it's the corruption of mankind. It is the moment where the text describes the sons of God. So verse 2, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves wherever they chose. And then as it goes on, God says, you know, I'm not going to put up with this, just abbreviating, and therefore, you know, and then that leads to the flood. And there's some extra verses in this, and there's talk about Nephilim as well. So what I will do is I'll ask you to start out, and I'll say what initially drew you to study the sons of God in Genesis? You did. Sorry, just to also give some background. You did a dissertation in this as well for your Bible study. So you've spent a lot of time on this topic. You know, you've written a dissertation. I've read through the dissertation, so I kind of have a bit of background there, and. But I come at it as a layman, so I had some views of this topic. It wasn't really a big topic for me. It's just, there's some. My view, I think, is probably what the common view is, which is, it was fallen angels, you know, took wives, and they created the heroes of old, the big, you know, these very important people of old who had special gifts. But you've explored this topic in detail. And it's fascinating, and actually I've had my views of that challenged as well. So with that preparation, so just to go to that first question, initially, what drew you to study this topic?
I like the book of Hebrews. It's one of my favorite books in the New Testament, because predominantly my favorite books have always been the Old Testament. What I like about the book of Hebrews is it takes stories out of the Old Testament and expands upon them from a Christ-centered point of view. And right at the beginning of the book of Hebrews, in chapter 1, verse 5, it says, "To which of the angels do you call son?" And I found that really fascinating. Because Hebrews has a high Christology. In other words, they were saying that the new covenant is different from the old covenant. In the old covenant, the angels were the ones who related the message to the people of God. But in the latter days, in the New Testament, you have spoken to us through the person of your Son. But what is even more phenomenal about that is as Christianity has gone on and on and on through the annals of history, you found almost a disassociation with what Christ says about who we are in God. He talks about us being his friends. But then he goes on and says, you're more than friends. You know, your sons. You have an inheritance.
Right.
It says of Jesus,
Yes.
he has the double portion, but it says of us that we have a portion in Christ. We can call God Father. And what you find in the medieval phases, that there was a disassociation with the average believer or the average Christian being a son of God, and more of association that Jesus is the Son of God.
Right.
He's not the only Son of God. We are adopted children. But what is really phenomenal is in every other passage of the Bible, when it refers to Son of God or Son of Yahweh, it only ever refers to a human being. Right. And that human being in particular was the son of David, of the line of kings. In the Genesis 6 text, it says son of Elohim. And Elohim is such a plurality of a word that could be used for the God of the Hebrews or the gods. And what you find that this, over a period of time as history has developed, starting off with the likes of Abraham, you find Abraham comes from a polytheistic background.
Right.
But he becomes what you call henotheistic. And henotheistic means he worshipped one God, but he believed in many gods. And this became problematic because as revelation went on through Judaism and then in through Christianity, we became monotheistic. And when we became monotheistic, then we had to explain away all the other things that were in the Old Testament, which may have alluded to other beings that had power, that were in competition with the God of the Hebrews. But equally also, we have to be very mindful that in pagan cultures, often kings, emperors, were often referred to as sons of God. You see it in the New Testament when it talks about Caesar Augustus. He was referred to as the Son of God. You see it in Pharaoh, even in the Old Testament, which is even in Genesis. Pharaoh is even in Genesis. He refers to himself as Son of God. But equally, if we look at the cultures that surround, the Hebrews of old or the Abrahams of old, because Abraham came from the city of Ur, which came from the Sumerian Akkadian Empire. And even the terminology that's used there of the kings that came from these empires, you find often they refer to their lineage or their parenthood as being related to some gods. A prime example of this is the king called Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was a hero in this age. And in this age, it refers to his mother being a higher god and his father being a lesser god. If you look in the lineage of the kings of Sumeria and Akkadian backgrounds, even in the king's list, which is an ancient document that we have that listed the number of kings that went down until the flood and beyond the flood, we find even mentioned in the lines that the kingship descended from heaven and visited a city-state, and that king then became the authority in the land. One of those kings it mentions, because I've mentioned already Gilgamesh, who's in that list, but another king called Dumatzi, it refers to himself, Dumatzi, the god king, within that text. So there is an opportunity to realize even here that in the pagan culture, they could almost deify kings. It doesn't necessarily mean that they think that this king is a god himself, but they see the title of kingship as being son to the fatherhood of gods. And there's very much you find in these city-states, even with Nebuchadnezzar, if you take, for example, in Babylon, he is the one who represents Marduk on earth. Even in that language that we use in the Lord's Prayer, our Father in heaven, and Jesus is the Son who represents on earth. It's very related with kings and messianic thing. And not just that, also the shepherding element of it, because the kings were seen as the shepherds of the people. If you look at the kings, they had the staff in one hand, and they had the mace or the rod in the other hand. You see it with all the pharaohs, like I think is it Tutankhamun. He's got the right to rule, but also the right to fight on behalf of the people and on behalf of the gods.
So it's interesting. You've given a lot of exposition there. So there's a lot of topics we jumped around. So I think we'll have to hit some of those, and I'll come back to those. But one of the things, I'm going to go back to sort of the basics as somebody might read that text. And one of the things is it says the sons of God, saw the daughters of man were beautiful or good, or and so there's obviously a distinction being made there with like sons of God versus daughters of man, not daughters of God, right? So for someone looking at that, they might say, well, that seems to be very clearly saying that the sons of God are, otherwise they would say the sons of man, right? So why isn't it the sons of man? And why, if you understand, it's like I think what you're proposing is that the sons of God are more like kings who proclaim themselves gods, not literally sons of God, which I think we agree there's only one son. But a lot of people's view is that they're sort of angelic beings. They're beings that have come down, fallen angels perhaps. That was always my views. The fallen angels have come to earth, saw that the women daughters are beautiful. So why would the scripture have sons of God but have like daughters of man? For example,
it's a very interesting point. I mean, if you look prior to this text, you see a conversation that goes on with after Cain has killed Abel, and in that conversation it talks about Adam then has a son who is in his image. And Adam is in the image of God. And so there's an inference that's there that the Adam is God's son. And then he has another son who's in the image of Adam, which Cain is not. There's a separation between the line of Seth and the line of Cain. And when you go forward into that story where it talks about the sons of God and the daughters of men, that word or that phrase, they see that they're good, has been mentioned elsewhere in Scripture. It was mentioned right at the very beginning when Eve, the daughter, saw that the fruit was good. And there's a comparison being made here that those who were faithful to God have all of a sudden found those who are unfaithful to God to be attractive, to the point that they've compromised their relationship with God for the pursuit of what they desired. So they're reflecting the same sin that Eve committed in the garden in the taking of the fruit is now being reflected here with the sons of God taking the daughters for themselves. But the question is, how are they taking? Because that idea of appropriation of taking means that there's no respect whether these people are married or not. It's not a gentle such and such. It's almost kind of like that idea of the king in the harem. He desires whatever he wants. He takes whatever woman he wants. And then the quarreling stories that follow on after that in Abraham and in Isaac are the wife-sister stories, where they pretend that their wives, because they're beautiful and they're attractive, are their sisters, because there are these kings that they're fearful of who will take their wives, kill them, and bring them into the harem.
Yeah.
And sure enough, these kings, and one of them is Pharaoh, who is a son of God, takes Sarah into his harem because Abraham hasn't.
But doesn't he have isn't there a dream or something where, or God gets angry with him, and then he gets angry with Abraham? He's like, why did you tell me she was your sister? Isn't there's something that happens like that?
That then happens.
Yeah.
I mean, the safeguarding element of this is what God is doing is he's protecting Abraham and Sarah because the inference could be made that Isaac is a result, or the promised child is a result of whatever went on with Sarah and Pharaoh in the harem.
Yeah, so what
is happening? God is stepping in and intervening so that there's no shadow of a doubt that although he's taken this woman into his harem, nothing sexual has happened.
Yeah.
God has stopped it in the bud, because there is a sense, isn't there? If God has promised right at the very beginning when he says to the serpent that he will crush your head and you will bite his heel. They call this the proto-evangelicon, the idea that God is already speaking about the Christ.
Right, yeah.
And it's through this line that God, through your seed, Abraham, all nations will be blessed.
Yeah.
Now, the Israelites believe that's talking about them, plural. Well, we as Christians believe it is talking about the person of Jesus Christ.
Yes, yeah.
He is the seed through which all nations will be blessed. And it's the truth. If you look at reality, how worldwide is the Christian faith?
Yeah.
Because of the actions of Jesus. The Jewish faith, or the Jewish God, has reached all the nations. All the nations have been blessed as a result of the person of Jesus Christ. So that protection of the seed and the lineage of that seed that goes down through the generations, the enemy tries to snatch.
Right.
Because we can talk about these kings, as I said, there are definitely demonic influences behind these kings and their actions, because they will take the wives, they will rape, they will kill, they will destroy.
Right, yeah.
And this is the punishment that then happens in that story of the sons of God. Because you have to ask yourself the question, if it was the angels, why is it the human beings that are punished at the end of that story?
Well, so actually, I've got a question about that, but I want to go back to, you made a distinction between Cain and Seth. So you got Cain and Abel. Abel presents a good offering to God, and Cain is jealous, envious, and kills Abel, and then Seth is born, right? But you made the distinction between sort of Cain not being a son of God and Seth being a son of God, of being that line. But where do you get that distinction from? So
in John's Gospel, I think it's chapter 7.
Right.
Jesus is talking to the Jewish people. And he says, before Abraham, I was.
Yes, right.
They went to stone him, and he starts talking about you're of your father. You're not of your father in heaven. You're of your father, the devil. He says, because they're not recognizing who he is, and they're starting to declare the miracles that he's performing are demonic rather than of God. And he says, your father was a murderer in the beginning. What is he pointing to? He's pointing to Cain.
Right, yeah.
Why is Cain marked? God marks Cain.
Yes, yeah.
And then the lineage of Cain goes further. Lamech not only kills people, but boasts about killing people and boasts about the inheritance of Cain. It's, if you look at the language that's used of how you interpret the meanings of the names, for example, Cain means purchased. So when Eve gave birth to Cain, she believed that he was going to purchase their ticket back to the Garden of Eden, because the promise that came that your offspring would crush the head of the serpent, he would. She believed there was going to be a redemption.
Right.
But by the time it came to Abel, she named Abel vanity. She'd come to the conclusion that it was never going to happen. Cain had disappointed her. You know, Abel was a disappointment. Her offspring weren't bringing back the necessary purchase and relationship with God. Even though Abel's sacrifice was accepted, Cain's sacrifice was rejected. Not because of what he was sacrificing, but because of his heart. Sin is at the door. Anger, jealousy, self-worth, all those things. But when you come to Seth, the name Seth means righteous one, rightly appointed. All of a sudden, God is doing something new in Seth. It goes on to say in that verse after Seth, he had a son, and it says, in those days, the people started to worship God.
That's interesting.
You know, there's a transformation that's taken. So you've got these two alternating lineages. The lineage that worships God, that's in relationship with God, and the lineage that's abandoned God in the pursuit of worldly domination, worldly power, worldly renown, worldly skills, being able to achieve things in humanity's own worth, own self, technology. And you see all the technological advances that happen with humanity in this area here. But in Seth's lineage, none of that's mentioned. What is mentioned is the right heart towards God, until all of a sudden you get this story where it talks about the sons of God.
And the sons of God, in your view, come from Seth's lineage.
So in the traditional view of all Christianity, the traditional Christianity believes that it is the Seth lineage. There is some question as to whether the sons of God are of the lineage of Cain as well. There are other views that promote that, because if you were to see that it's the sons of the gods, then it's different. It depends how you interpret that phrase, Benahar Elohim.
Right.
Sons of the gods or sons of God. If it's sons of God, then you've got to look at the good lineage. But if you interpret sons of the gods, then you're focusing very much on those who worship other gods besides Yahweh.
Yeah. So that word, Bene, how do you pronounce that again?
I'm probably butchering it myself, but Benihar Elohim.
Benihar Elohim.
So Ben, you know, you get that word Benjamin. You know, Ben means son in Hebrew. Daughter means Bath. That's what, so you got Bathsheba.
Right.
You know,
and what you're saying is I mean, not what you're saying, but the Elohim, the word Elohim, which can represent. So it's interpreted as either God or gods.
Yes.
So
it's interpreted of, you know, God or divine beings, even in some cases. What is different, you know, because often people point to the book of Job. And they say that Satan came amongst the sons of the gods.
Well, that's what I was going to ask about, was Job.
So but the difference between that text is, in the Job story, they're in heaven.
Right.
But the sons of God are not in heaven. In the Genesis story, they're on earth.
They're on earth.
So there's a separation between what's going on in heaven and what's going on earth. And that needs to be clarified. Because if the sons of God were in heaven and they took the daughters to themselves, the daughters of the human beings would be in heaven. You know, but they're very much active on the earth.
Yes.
But equally, then the punishment that then happens is the lifespan is shortened. But it's not the heavenly being's lifespan that's shortened. It's humanity's life that's been shortened. So if you were to say, well, God is a fair God and God is a just God, then it would only be the daughter's lifespan that is shortened. But it's not the daughter's lifespan that's shortened. It's the whole of humanity. And then not far after that, the flood comes as well.
But I do want to ask, who are the sons of God in Job?
Yes.
Versus who are versus this distinction? Who are they?
So most people would say they're the sons of the gods.
So you're going with you think
So-
it's plural in each case.
Yes.
It's
So,
plural.
I mean, it's case in point. You find in these texts that they often mention Yahweh or Elohim or El Shaddai.
And Al stands for
So in the pantheon of the Canaanite gods,
right.
El was the father god. He was the
Right.
head god.
Yeah.
This was the God that introduced himself to Abraham. Abraham didn't know God as Yahweh. Yahweh introduced himself through Moses.
Right.
But in Abraham's pantheon, you had El
Yeah.
and you had Asherah, his wife.
Right. Yeah.
You know,
Okay.
it was a pantheon of gods, the sons of El, or
Okay.
the sons of Elohim, who could also be the Baals.
Right. So when in Job, when Satan was among those sons of gods, but he's addressing God. Can you just like elaborate on that more so I can understand? So my picture is the sons of God being angels, say in heaven,
Yeah.
but and then they're talking to God, and Satan is saying, "Oh, look at your servant Job. We're gonna,
Yeah.
you ruin his life. He'll
They could
turn against you." But,
they could be gods.
yeah.
Like that. They could be
Could be
divine
other
beings.
gods. Yeah, divine beings. But is that a case of the Bible getting its? Is the Bible getting its source from somewhere else, like a text that's out? Like you said, a Canaanite religion. Is it getting it from the Canaanites, or is it a case of? Is it being translated correctly? What's the, because you're saying the sons of gods would be just these princely people.
It's interesting. First and foremost, let's take David for example. David, when he's fleeing away from Saul, Micah puts what in his bed?
It's a little. It's a what do we call it? Worship.
It's an idol.
Idol. That's it. Yes, that's what the word I was after. Is idol.
So
yeah.
Let's go further back into the Genesis story.
Right.
Rebecca. She steals her father's idol.
Yes.
And
yeah.
puts it in a
Idols,
saddlebag.
Yeah.
And then says that she's in. So
Yeah.
there are mentions of gods and idols.
Right.
Even when you look at, for example, the sacrifice of the goats.
Yeah.
Where one goat is to represent the sin of thing, and the other one is a scapegoat, which goes out.
Yeah.
And it says it goes out towards the spirit in the wilderness. So there's very a sense. Well, even with the, let's take an example further in the book of Kings, where it talks about Saul goes and approaches a Median.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
And the Median, he wants to talk to Samuel.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And he says, "One like a Rephaim comes forth from the earth."
And what's a Rephaim?
So a Rephaim is a kingly spirit, or a god, or a being of power, a judge. Samuel was a judge. Samuel was a king, but he was a spirit. He wasn't a body. So there are elements where people look at beings in heaven and they say, "Oh, they must all be angels." But
Gotcha.
there is a sense that there is a paradise where human spirits go to.
Right. Okay.
You could even look at the book of Hebrews again. It talks about the cloud of witnesses.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
That have gone before.
Yeah.
That are,
Okay,
looking down and cheering the thing.
Yeah.
Now, it says there is a man in heaven.
Yeah. Yeah.
He has a body. His name is Jesus.
Yeah.
But there is a sense of also disassociated spirits.
So your
They could be. I'm not saying.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
And sometimes in life we have to admit when we don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what happens in Christian culture is we have to explain everything.
Well.
And so looking back at this text, when people have gone into a monotheistic element, it must be the angels.
Right. Yeah. So in actual fact,
but the problem with that interpretation is
Mm.
Jesus in Matthew's gospel says, when we die and we go to heaven, we will be like the angels and not have marriage.
yeah. Yeah.
You know, angels, do they have physical bodies that are capable of
Yeah.
having sexual relations with women? A lot of this comes from the book of Enoch, which was written a long time
Yeah.
after the Genesis
So
text.
yeah, so I'd actually need to ask you about that. But so just to clarify, then I think looking at Job, what you're saying is quite possibly it's this when you're talking about this cloud of witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
You're actually saying it might not be angels. It may be something of that lineage of Seth, or the cloud of witnesses that are with God in heaven,
Mm-hmm.
but not necessarily angels.
Mm-hmm.
Just sort of.
But it could also be a henotheistic
Or it could just be
worldview.
influenced by the author
Yes.
at the time, who was a
henotheist.
A henotheist.
It wasn't a monotheist.
And so he was just saying, well, there was, when Satan was there amongst all the other gods, all the other sort of, beings, that was that conversation taking place. That's kind of your assumption on it. Yeah.
Well, it's also, if you look in the Old Testament, it's assumed in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
You take, for example, when Nebuchadnezzar conquered a nation, he gave glory to his god, Marduk. And when the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant, they give glory to their god, Dagon, being more powerful than Yahweh. So when there were battles that took place, the kings and their armies represented the gods in heaven.
Yeah.
So they believed that there was warfare that was going on in the heavens.
Yes, yeah.
That was also taking place on earth.
Well, there is that battle in Genesis that happens where they say Abraham needs to keep Abraham, as long as he keeps his arms in the air, they'll win.
Yes.
And then as his arms start to tire, the army starts to lose. So then they go, oh, quick, get some people under to hold his arms up, which is interesting.
It's an interesting thing. The Hebrew faith is really interesting because there's a transition that goes on. When they go into exile, they have to come to terms with, is their God still on their side? Is their God still with them?
Yeah.
Does their God still exist? Because in the mindset of the nations in these seasons and in these times, gods only existed if they had a people that were empowered or blessed or strong. And the stronger the people were, the stronger the God was. And so there's a transition phase that happens in the exile where all of a sudden they're having to reconcile the defeat, the loss, the exile out of the land, because gods were also associated with land. But the difference with the Yahweh God is he takes slaves who have no land, takes them out of captivity, and brings them into a land.
Almost to prove
that he's not tied to the land. If you look at Balaam, when he's cursing the Israelites, he has to go to different mountains, different places, different lands of power where his God will answer him.
Right, yeah.
And if it doesn't work at that mountain, then he went to another mountain. But every mountain he went to, he was told to curse the Israelites. But instead he kept giving them the blessing. Because it's proving that the God of the Hebrews is not limited to a land, a place, a season, a time. All the earth is the Lord's. And that's the difference between the God, Yahweh, and even El, in that sense. El was very much localized. I mean, in Canaanite history, they believed El stayed in the garden.
Right, yeah.
And that's why they started to worship Baal, because Baal was the more intimate God who was with them in the seasons that rewarded the lands. But that title Baal was also loose because Baal meant Lord. And so you could have many different Baals, different areas. or lives and stuff.
So you mentioned the Book of Enoch. I know that figures quite prominently in your dissertation, and you've referenced that. You've referenced the Book of Enoch as being that's where this idea of these angelic beings comes from, with the sons of God or sons of gods. So what is? Could you explain what the Book of Enoch is and sort of give a summary of that? And
so the Bible is very clear that the introduction of sin that came into this world was what happened in the Garden of Eden. The Book of Enoch proposes another idea where sin originated from. And the focus of that other idea is the introduction of sin through the angels.
And just to interrupt, when was that? Who is it written by? When was that written as well? The Book of Enoch.
So the Book of Enoch is round about, I think, around about the 2nd century. Right. It's somewhere around either not that long after Jesus' day or even around the same time.
Right. Okay.
It's a reflection of 2nd century Judaism.
Okay. Right.
And it's a weird and wonderful book. It's ironic, often you hear people say it says in the Bible that they're angels. The term angel mentioned in the Bible is more associated with the word malak.
Right.
And it's where you get the name, the Book of Malachi. And the focus is not on the fact that they're spiritual beings, but the fact that they're messengers. And then you get different types of angels as well in the Bible. You get the type that appear to look like men, Gabriel. It says the man Gabriel.
Yeah.
But you also get the type that look like beasts, the cherubs. And then you get the seraphs, which are more like flying serpent beings that spit fire or spit poison, that fly in the realm of God. So angels don't tend to look as we have fantasized them to look in medieval Christianity.
Yeah.
Cherubs are not little babies with wings. This is an association that comes from what's the god of love that fires the arrow?
It's like I know what you mean.
We see it,
Valentine,
Valentine's Day. Cherubs don't look like that.
Influenced by Roman.
Yes, cherubs in the Bible are about 15 foot tall.
Yeah.
In the Book of Enoch, it talks about the children that are born between these angels and the human beings are 80 foot. Now, imagine a woman giving birth to an 80-foot child.
Yeah, but wouldn't they be small? Yeah. And start small and grow big.
Start small and grow very quickly, But even in the Bible, the cherubs are around about 15 foot if you look at the span of it. What you had in Judaism was this movement of many different sources that came out called the pseudepigrapha.
Yeah.
And what they did is they took names of prominent figures in the Bible to add gravitas to what they were saying.
Like Enoch, yeah.
So say this is Enoch's testimony. Well, Enoch was thousands and thousands of years before. And this book was not included in the original canon. The Jewish people discredited it from being a part of their Bible or their Mishra. And so if they did that, there was a reason why they did that. Because of the fantastical thing. But we like that kind of thing. You find if you want to sell books in Christian culture, talk about end times, talk about angels, and the more sensational it is, people will buy it.
One of the stories of the Bible is, of course, Lot, when I think it's two angels appear and come to his house to warn him that the city is going to be destroyed. And the men of the city see these two angels and they're like, well, bring them out so we can have sex with them. They look beautiful. Let's And so for me, there must be, so when I think about that, I think, well, obviously they didn't look like angels, or they didn't look like these, monsters or anything like that. They looked like real men. They looked like, and they looked as though, obviously they must have had that appearance of looking very real, very like a person. They wouldn't have had any anything special about them that would have triggered a fear response. It would have just they would have and Lot, I presume, wouldn't have known either when he invited him to his house. He wouldn't at that point have known that they were angels until they kind of announced and said, "Hey, we're actually here to give you a message, and warn you."
Yeah.
So for that story, okay, there must be. So looking at that, somebody, reading that, I think most people might say, well, obviously they look like people.
Yeah.
Obviously they had the appearance of like, yeah, we could have relations with them. What would you say to that? What would you say about that story, and what how that makes sense?
Yeah, I think we have to divorce our Western thinking from the text that we're reading. In our Western thinking, Zeus went around and slept with loads of women, and there's a tendency to amplify Greek mythology onto what is a Near Eastern belief system. And what I find really amazing is there is a sense that when you read about angels in the Bible, there's no mention of a female counterpart.
Yeah.
All the angels that have names all have male names. So the question then, if there's no female angels, then how do they have children? Or are they built in a way to have children? But equally, we've talked about the New Testament where it says you will entertain angels and not know that you've entertained angels.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
What is very clear, and we mentioned this in the conversation that we'd had a while back, was that when they went to try and molest these so-called angels, or these spiritual beings, they were struck down with blindness. The beings have the power to alter the perceptions of human beings so that they can't see. You see this with Jesus, don't you? Jesus is about to be stoned. They pick up the stones to stone him, and it says he slipped through the crowds.
Yeah,
he had the power all of a sudden to not be seen by them.
Yeah.
And so I think if somebody has power over people's sight, they can make them see what they want them to see.
Right.
They can blend in, they can camouflage, they can not be seen or seen. So there is a sense that angels have the power over human perception. But angels also do the will of God. And the will of God obviously isn't for angels to sleep with human beings. So the people who are represented in the text, or the beings that are represented in the text, are not doing God's will. So there is a sense that they're not angels. There could be a sense that they are demons. Because that's what you're saying, they're fallen angels.
Fallen angels,
demons.
yes, yeah.
But then you have to ask yourself the question, how do demons operate in the New Testament? And what I find very interesting is that demons don't seem to take on human form of themselves. They have to enter into a human being.
Take possession
To be able to interact with the natural world. It's almost like they've lost the power that angels have. And maybe that power is God-given.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah. So how do they then operate? They take possession of a human being. When they're cast out of Legion, for example, they request to go into pigs because they don't want to go back to the abyss. So there is a sense that disembodied demons cannot remain in the natural world without a host.
Right, yeah.
So if you wanted to, then what you have to then say, well, if demons are involved in the story of the sons of God, then maybe they're involved by inhabiting the kings.
Yeah, that's what I wondered, if it was a case of, you know,
You could
demonic
have a
possession.
combination,
Yeah.
and I'm not
Yeah.
opposed to that explanation,
Yeah.
because you know there is a sense that when you do horrific things in life, there's a motivation of an evil spirit that's behind those horrific things.
Yeah.
A manifestation, if you so to speak. You know, often, you know, we don't ask ourselves the question, where do thoughts come from? Where do emotions come from? Are they come from a good source, or they come from a bad source?
Yes. Yeah.
Because the Bible tells us to keep each thought captive and weigh it up. Is this from God, or is this from the spirit of the age?
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing that we have, you know, we've talked about as well, is like, you know, when things make you angry, or sort of, you know, you know, our emotions play a part, and sometimes you have to think to yourself, like, why am I angry? Why is this making me angry right now? You know, and what's, you know, and is there an influence? I'm not saying you can become possessed suddenly and you know, start feeling angry, but is there something more happening in the spiritual to kind of influence your emotions, or influence your your perception of something that's happening?
Yeah, it's like that conversation that Peter has with Jesus. Jesus says, "Whom do you say I am?" And he says about whoever everybody else says.
Yeah,
and he says, "You're the Son of God." And he says, "Oh, that's come from my Father in heaven."
Yes.
And then he says, "I'm going to tell you about where I'm going. I'm going to go to the cross." And he says, "Oh, no, Lord, don't do that.
Yeah.
Get thee behind me, Satan." So in the same sentence.
So we can almost, that's very interesting, right? So it's almost like it's so funny, right? The first thing he says to Peter, like, "Oh, that came from God." And then, like, the second thing Peter says, like, "No, that came from Satan," right? So we can almost kind of, in a sense, we can project, like, the you know, in the way we treat people, or the way we speak to each other, we can almost sort of project what you know, a maybe a demonic thought stream, you know, as opposed to a
there's an interesting phrase, isn't it? It says, "Faith comes through hearing."
Yeah, for hearing the word of God. Yeah.
Who are we listening to?
Yeah.
Which voices have influence on our lives, and what's the spirit behind those voices?
Yeah.
Is it the spirit of fear?
Yeah.
Or is it the spirit of love?
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. So I've got a question actually about you know, the victims of these sons of God.
Yeah.
So as you say, they're taking women and they're taking them for their wives, and presumably raping them, or, you know, and doing whatever they wanted, which was this wickedness, right? But why would there be people? There'd obviously be people who are innocent who were the victims of this, right? So if a woman is raped, then she's a victim of the one who's done it. You know, obviously, we talked about Abraham and Sarah, and it was like, Abraham would clearly be a victim of the Pharaoh, you know, who would kill him to take his wife, right?
Yeah.
So why would God flood the world, or flood the earth for that reason, when they're, you know, irrespective of good or bad, and they were obviously the victims as well? Why would innocent people be punished? And King David's, you know, same with King David's census, you know, the people were punished for King David, you know, why would that be?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? You know, when everybody looks at Adam and they say that sin came into the world because of one man, why should we all suffer for the sin of that one man?
Yes. Yeah.
But the question could be flipped on its head. Because of one man, all humanity can be saved.
Yeah.
Why should all humanity be saved through the man Jesus?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
You know, so we can flip it in two ways. And the truth be known, I look at it like this with, you know, often people turn around and say, yeah, oh, it's all Adam's fault. It's all Eve's fault. But if we were in the same position as Adam and Eve, we'd make the same choices without God. You know, and, you know, whether you're the victim or whether you're the victor, what he really says in that flood story and that flood narrative, there was only Noah
Who was good.
who was pleasing to God.
Yeah.
So God wasn't just examining whether somebody was a victim or whether somebody was thing. He was examining the hearts of the whole of humanity.
Yeah.
And the whole of humanity's hearts were turned against God.
Yeah.
You know, the victim would have done the same to the one who was abusing him.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? In that sense,
Yeah.
it was that sense that
Yeah.
humanity saw themselves as God.
Yeah.
And were entitled to whatever they wanted.
Well, I think that's a good place for us to stop there, because we could carry on, but I'm getting like notice of we're hitting our time limit. So I think what we can do is we can end with final question. Mm-hmm. Okay, and the question I have for you, Andrew, is 100 years from now, what is the one thing the generations of tomorrow can take away from the church of today?
Yeah. So I think the one thing that I hope the generation in 100 years' time could take from the church of today is it's not about happiness. It's about goodness. Only God is truly good. And if we could teach that generation to be good in a world which declares actually it's all about happiness, I think we've done our job right. Because the counter argument is, if you're always pursuing happiness, you're always going to be miserable. There's so many people out there who are depressed because they're told that they have to be happy. But if you tell people it's about goodness, it's about character, you know, it's about being able to hold your head up even when things go wrong around you. And it's about owning who you are. You know, I think you're a step closer to God. And I think that's a real focus. I love the fact that when I was listening to R.C. Sproul, and he was talking about the characteristics of God, and he says often in Christianity we talk about love, we talk about justice, we talk about mercy, we talk about all these great characteristics of God. But he says the one that's mentioned in the Bible, often in statements of phrase, is holiness. God is holy. God is good. If we can teach that to the next generation or to those generations going on, I think we've done the job that God has called us to do. Pursue holiness. And that's not for the sake of your salvation getting into heaven, you know, but it is for the sake of wanting to please God and love him.
Pursue holiness, not happiness.
Yeah. Cool.
Well, that's it's been a fascinating conversation. It's been a long conversation, but really enjoyed. I think we've learned quite a bit about you, and we also learned quite a bit about the topic of sons of God. And there's so much more to explore there. Yeah, thank you for the stimulating conversation, and thank you to our listeners for tuning in and listening to this first podcast. We hope you've enjoyed watching or listening to this episode. If you have any thoughts about the topics from this episode, feel free to leave a comment or reach out to the team. Don't forget to follow, like, and subscribe wherever you're joining us from so you won't miss the next episode. We appreciate you listening in and look forward to bringing you more content through Life Explored. Bye for now.